Alright, so we are currently going through the very beginnings of what leads up to the Civil War, so we'll call this the pre-Civil War set of notes. It'll take about a day and a half, 2 days of class. And first thing we've got to talk about the economic, social, and political events that start at the Mexican-American War and basically lead to the Civil War breaking out a decade or so later. So first things first, I'll start clicking around. When we're talking about the Civil War, we got to keep this in mind. Oftentimes we think of it as a rebellion, and it was, but not in the same way you would think like an insurrection of like rebels within a larger population. Because of the geographic lines and because of the level of sophistication of the Confederacy, we basically consider this a one country versus another country for a time period. So this is the United States of America on the left there, and the Confederate States of America on the right, the stars and stripes on the left, and the stars and bars on the right. Each star representing a state in the Union. And you'll notice the stars on the left don't change because, according to the Union, the rebellion by the South was illegal. Although, for practical purposes, we treat them as two separate countries. Each has a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. Each had their own courts. Each had their own laws that were made. They had their own federal bureaucracies. It was a very sophisticated rebellion. If you want to characterize it as a rebellion, it's better to look at it more along the lines of two warring countries, one having just recently split off from the other, and the other country trying to re-annex the old country back in, the Confederate States of America. All right, so first things first, we're going to talk about an early cause of this. Basically, this kind of catalyst. This is what starts things off and kind of leads us down this road to Civil War, and that's the Missouri Compromise. And note the date is 1820, so this is fairly early on in the country's history. We've got a grand total of 30 years as a constitutional republic under our belt. It's pretty early on. So basically, people who were alive during the American Revolution were obviously alive during this time as well, including Jefferson, who made a very famous quote about it we talked about earlier in the class. I'll take a moment right now to apologize for the sound in the background and try my best to get the feedback in the background to be gone, but it's just not working properly. Alright, so this compromise was authored by a guy named Henry Clay. He's the perennial presidential loser, runs for president like 6-7 times, loses each time, but he's also a great compromiser. And he basically comes up with the notion that, well, we have all this land out where we recently gathered from the Louisiana Purchase, and we got to figure out whether or not it's going to be a slave or free state. So this temporarily solved the issue of new states coming in from that Louisiana Purchase area. He tried to maintain a balance in Congress between the North and the South, but really the slave states versus the free states. And they did this by allowing Missouri to be made as a slave state and Maine coming in as a free state. And the line of demarcation is what's known as the 3630 parallel, or better known as basically the southern border of Missouri. And that sets up this sectionalism between North versus South over the issue of slavery. And right there, if you look right where my mouse pointer is, that's the line, and then you notice Missouri just dips down below it. That's how it got admitted as a slave state, based on that line of demarcation. Alright, and then we jump forward about 30 years, the Compromise of 1850. This is all the stuff that happens after the Mexican-American War. So the Mexican-American War is over, we have all that new land, and we got to figure out what to do with it, again, with regard to the notion of slavery and how it's going to be dealt with there. So California would be admitted as a free state. That's done, and then there was a promise made that Utah, New Mexico would be able to vote and decide on the issue of slavery based on popular sovereignty. So basically, they could vote in whether or not they wanted slaves or not. Basically based on popular vote. And finally, the part that really ticked off the North was the Fugitive Slave Act. Basically, it would be enforced as part of the compromise. So it basically was a Fugitive Slave Act with some real teeth to it. So this angered the North because it made everybody up north suddenly turn into a slave catcher, because by law they could not hold slaves, they could not take care of runaway slaves, they'd be breaking the law by doing that. They had an affirmative duty to report them. It was just a nasty situation to be in. You can stop on any of these maps or little guides if you want to take a look at them. Alright, then we get a little more detail on the Fugitive Slave Act. Again, it's part of the Compromise of 1850, so we are now 11 years away from the outbreak of the Civil War taking place, so we're pretty close to it. This required northern states to return escaped slaves to their owners in the South. This put a duty upon people, like your average citizen. It basically made them potentially be deputized to go catch slaves, even if they didn't want to. It was a bad situation. Basically, anytime the government forces you to take an affirmative action, it's going to be a harsh time period. But essentially what this does, it makes everybody up north who might have been anti-slavery before, now they're full-blown abolitionists, because now they're being forced to do something they believe is either morally wrong or they just don't want to do. Again, there was an economic difference versus a moral difference in slavery. Some folks up north just wanted to stop the expansion of slavery because they considered it economically unfair, while others on the abolitionist side viewed slavery as a moral sin. They wanted it dealt with because it was terrible as a sin on a moral level. And this is a very famous ad that was put out of paper up in Boston. Basically, in Boston was a big refuge for escaped slaves as well as freed blacks, and abolitionist sentiment was huge up there. So when they put these out, like they knew there were kidnappers and slave catchers. It was not uncommon for a slave catcher to be caught by a mob and lynched and killed. That happened on occasion. It was you did not have friends in Massachusetts if you were a slave catcher. They didn't like the notion of it, and they certainly hated it after the Fugitive Slave Act came out, which put an affirmative duty on your average citizen to actually go out and report if they knew there was an escaped slave somewhere, even if they found that kind of reporting morally reprehensible. All right, and then we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this is, again, trying to kick the can down the road, trying to figure out how to deal with the slavery issue. We are now a grand total of 7 years away from the Civil War breaking out. So this is a congressional law that allowed previously unorganized territories, in this case Kansas and Nebraska, to choose whether or not to allow slavery in their state by popular sovereignty. This was proposed by a guy named Stephen Douglas out of Illinois, who becomes famous for debating Abraham Lincoln later on. Now, why this matters, it repeals the Missouri Compromise, because Kansas and Nebraska, in case you want to go back and look at a map, they're not in keeping with that north-south border line created by the Missouri Compromise. So Kansas and Nebraska are both up or north of that line, but they will have the option to become slave states. That means that they're effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise, and because of this, all of a sudden now slavery more than ever before is not a political issue, because it's based on the vote. The vote and enfranchisement, that now will determine whether or not slavery will start up. So this repealed the Missouri Compromise and caused the creation of the Republican Party, which began essentially as a combination of free soilers who didn't want slavery on the land, as well as abolitionists, and they become the Republican Party basically to fight off the expansion of slavery. And you'll notice here Kansas territory, all that area, yeah, that's definitely above this 3630 parallel, so that's why it basically wipes out the Missouri Compromise. You take a look here, you'll see the various compromises as time goes on, and you'll definitely see the North versus South dichotomy taking place here, and as time goes on, if the war hadn't broken out, more of these issues would have popped up, and we'll talk about why they were getting so violent in just a moment. Now, popular sovereignty, this is the notion that allows citizens to vote on an issue. So like in the modern time period, back in 2008, there was a popular sovereignty or a vote-based referendum issue in California on whether or not to allow gay marriage. It failed, and then later on the Supreme Court kind of came in and made gay marriage legal across the whole country. But it started out as a referendum on the gay marriage issue. This is the same thing. They're basically having referendums on the slavery issues in these territories. So they're basically putting up to popular vote whether or not there will be slavery in those areas. So anytime you see the word popular sovereignty, it means they're voting on something. It could be voting on a leader, it could be voting on a law in this case slavery laws. And this, there's Stephen Douglas. He's the guy that basically championed popular sovereignty, and he's kind of an interesting fellow because he was very, very short, and he often had to debate he wasn't president yet, Abraham Lincoln, who was like 6'4". So he was a little guy debating this big, tall guy. It was made for very good political cartoons from the time. We'll see more of those later on. All right, and then we get Bleeding Kansas. This guy down here, if you watch any of the documentaries with me in class, you'll notice this is John Brown. So John Brown is a militant abolitionist. He's not anti-slavery, he is an abolitionist. He wants not only to stop slavery from expanding it, he wants to never have slaves again. He wants them freed, he wants them to rise up and fight. And Bleeding Kansas was basically the first opportunity that he ever had to go out and fight on these issues. Essentially what happened was people who were pro-slavery sent their people to Kansas to go vote and live. People who were anti-slavery sent their people to Kansas to go vote and live. They had a series of votes. They each actually had different votes themselves. There was a pro-slavery vote in one part of the territory, an anti-slavery vote in the other part of the territory, each one claiming that their side won the vote because they ran the votes. And this led to a bunch of armed clashes in that area. It was just coming up over and over and over again. These people got killed in Bleeding Kansas. And this was not a trifling thing. It wasn't like like a couple shotguns being blown off at people. This was a full-blown, in some cases, skirmishes and military-style battles. So this was basically armed clashes between pro-slavery forces and settlers led by abolitionist John Brown, following the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Because basically when the Kansas-Nebraska Act came out and said, hey, you get to vote on it, they just sent everybody down there. And the problem was they sent them down there with things like cannons and rifles. So this is actually some settlers who were basically setting up what were called quote-unquote free state batteries, a battery being a line of artillery. They were bringing cannons, guys. This was not like a silly little, like, we're going to shoot at you. No, they're bringing military ordnance to go fight over the slavery issue and the expansion or the destruction of slavery. And lest you think that things were happening differently elsewhere, I'm going to go ahead and skip this one and go to the image of it just so you know what's going on. There was a guy named, there's what's called the Brooks-Sumner incident. It was basically these two folks right here. You got excuse me. You got Sumner over here and you got Brooks over here. So essentially, this is in Congress. So we've been talking about these battles kind of happening out in the frontier, and the frontier's so used to battles, so most like we think about it constantly, that's going to be a battle taking place in the frontier. But in this case, this is all in Congress. This is the Brooks-Sumner incident. So basically, Sumner comes out and makes a big long speech where he basically calls out Brooks and basically disparages his family, all in relation to slavery, saying that basically he's not a gentleman. He's made some other not so nice remarks about him. In response to this, Brooks takes out his walking cane and just beats the tar out of him in the middle of Congress, and not just like smacks him around the cane a little bit and he gets up and everybody walks back their corners. Like, Sumner had to go home. Like, he had to go home to recover and couldn't serve for very much longer. He was reelected later on. But like, we think about politics nowadays, how this would work. If something like this happened, they'd be forced to resign. They'd never see the political light of day again. They'd be lucky to be a talking head on any given news show ever again. They'd probably go to jail. But basically, Preston Brooks, who was pro-slavery from the South, beat Charles Sumner from the North with a cane during a session in the Senate. So this is the high level. Like, there's the House, which is considered like the rabble at this time because there's so many of them. Then there's the Senate, who is the upper house. This is happening in the upper house of Congress, where they're making major laws and major decisions. This demonstrates some deep-rooted sectionalism, North versus South, this slavery versus anti-slavery sentiment. And to put in perspective, like I said, if this had happened nowadays, they would have been forced to go home. They would never been allowed to serve again. They probably would never have gotten elected again. Brooks got reelected, and when he got home, like to his office in D.C., like nowadays you expect to get like a bunch of emails saying you're a disgrace, yada yada yada. Brooks would get packages, and they'd be these long packages, and he'd open them up, and he was just getting dozens of people sending him canes from his district. So this is people from the South, from his district in South Carolina, sending him canes with little notes attached to them saying things like, go hit him again. Like, this was not he was viewed as very positive from the South, and up north, obviously, being this cartoon kind of shows Southern chivalry, argument versus club, saying that the Southerner who was pro-slavery is just being an ape and just hitting them with a club. So this just kind of goes to show the deep-rooted sectionalism over this issue. This was North versus South, slave versus freedom. They were like, these were people from his district basically sending him joke canes in a show of support of what he did. He basically beat the tar of a person, nearly killed him, and they were saying how much they supported it. This is happening in the upper house of Congress. This would be unheard of nowadays, and he gets reelected and they support what he's doing. So this is just goes to show how incredibly divisive this time period was. And that'll be the end of this series, but then you get some pictures real fast, and we're going to stop right there. And thanks for watching, and I hope you will continue with the next one when I give you the next set of notes.